Canada is building walls, not of concrete, but of laws, and Haitian asylum seekers are paying the price. While the world watches the United States grapple with immigration, Canada is quietly implementing some of the most restrictive asylum policies in its modern history. We're talking about Bill C-2, a sweeping piece of legislation that critics are calling anti-immigrant and anti-refugee. But this isn't just about policy, it's about real people hiding in mud for hours, terrified of being caught by authorities. It's about families torn apart by arbitrary deadlines and bureaucratic nightmares. So what exactly is Canada doing to asylum seekers? And why are Haitians, already fleeing uncertainty in the United States, finding themselves trapped between two hostile systems? To understand this crisis, we need to look at what's happening on both sides of the border, and why it's creating a humanitarian disaster that experts say will only get worse. The story begins with a crash. On July 13th, in southern Quebec, a drunk driver plowed into a van carrying 12 migrants who had just crossed from the United States. Another van behind them, also filled with asylum seekers, swerved away to avoid detection by authorities. The first van rolled over, 4 people were injured and taken to hospitals. But here's where the story gets truly horrifying. The remaining 8 people fled into the woods. They weren't running from the accident. They were running from help. Because in Canada, if you're caught during your first 14 days after crossing from the United States, your asylum claim is automatically denied.
Sure. Well, we could start with the liberal crime crisis. We have a solution for the raging crime in our streets and even in our rural communities, and it's we call it the 3 strikes you're out law. Very simple. An offender commits 3 serious offenses and they are not eligible for bail, parole, probation, or house arrest. We're going to be putting that forward in a law that we hope the government will quickly pass so that we can take that tiny minority of criminals who are terrorizing our streets and put them behind bars so that we can make our communities safe again.
That's been implemented some places in the United States. It's been criticized that it doesn't necessarily work. Why do you feel it would work in Canada?
Well, it will work in Canada because we have the problem is a very simple one, actually. We have a very small number of people doing a phenomenal amount of crime. So in Vancouver, they had to arrest the same 40 offenders 6,000 times, so 150 times a year per person. If you took those 40 people off the street, you'd have 6,000 fewer people violated and victimized. But unfortunately, liberal laws let them be repeatedly released, even within minutes of their latest arrest, on bail. So this would lock them up, keep them out of society and circulation while people can live in peace. And instead, the liberal approach has been to go after licensed, law-abiding, trained and tested hunters and sport shooters who are not a risk. We think we should go after real criminals, and that would be a practical solution to stop what I call the liberal crime crisis that followed their introduction of these lax, easy laws on criminals.
Among those who fled was a woman with her children. For 4 hours, they lay in the mud, hoping not to be found by Canadian authorities. This woman was in the middle of what asylum seekers call the 14 days, a bureaucratic nightmare that forces people to live underground, literally hiding from the very country they're seeking protection from. During these 14 days, asylum seekers cannot be caught. They have to prove they were in Canada for the full period when they finally make their claim. If they're found, if they can't prove day 1 or day 14, their claim is denied and they face deportation. This isn't some fringe policy affecting a handful of people. This is the reality for thousands of Haitians fleeing north as their temporary protected status in the United States hangs by a thread. And now Canada is making it even harder. Bill C-2, officially called the Strong Borders Act, is Canada's response to what it calls growing migration pressures. But critics say it's really Canada's attempt to appease Donald Trump and avoid the worst of his threatened tariffs on Canadian exports.
Relationship with the United States. You have been quite adamant you don't like the fact that Canada has recently removed some tariffs on U.S. products coming into the country. Why don't you like that?
I would clarify slightly. What I would like to see is tariffs removed on both sides of the border. I think that the mistake that Mr. Carney has made is that he promised elbows up, and of course it's been elbows down ever since the election. He removes tariffs without getting anything in return, and he is signaling weakness. That's why the Americans have actually increased tariffs on Canada. The Chinese sense the same weakness, so they're increasing tariffs on our fish harvesters, seafood producers, and farmers. The weakness is costing Canadians here at home. So what I think we should do is go to President Trump and say, listen, why don't we both remove tariffs? Let's get to a tariff-free relationship again, and in exchange for that, we will build up our military like you haven't seen since the Second World War. We'll harden up our borders against drugs and other dangers. You'll be safer, we'll both be richer, and we'll be a stronger continent as a result.
The bill is massive, 16 different parts that fundamentally reshape how Canada handles immigration and asylum claims. Here's what it does. First, it makes it virtually impossible for people entering Canada from the United States to have their refugee claims reviewed. If you've been in Canada for more than a year without making a claim, you're automatically ineligible for refugee status. This applies retroactively to anyone who arrived after June 24, 2020. Second, it requires irregular border crossers, people who enter between official ports, to make their asylum claim within 14 days. Not the current system where you need to wait 14 days, but a new requirement to file within 14 days or lose your chance forever. Third, it gives the government sweeping powers to cancel, suspend, or change immigration documents immediately if they believe it's in the public interest. No due process, no appeals. Just executive power to destroy people's lives with the stroke of a pen. Immigration experts are calling this a fundamental attack on the right to seek asylum. Sherry Aiken, a law professor at Queen's University, says the one-year rule represents a major rollback of rights and that Bill C-2 directly mirrors policies in the United States. The timing isn't coincidental. As the Trump administration moves to end temporary protected status for Haitians, thousands are looking north for safety. But what they're finding is a Canada that's rapidly closing its doors. The numbers tell the story. By July 2024, an estimated 520,000 Haitians were eligible for TPS in the United States. Trump's Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem terminated their protection, originally set to expire in September 2025. A federal judge temporarily blocked this, extending protection until February 3, 2026. But the Trump administration says it vehemently disagrees and is working to overturn the ruling. This uncertainty has driven many Haitians to cross into Canada, usually through Quebec. But Canada's response has been to make the process more dangerous and more restrictive than ever before. The 14-day rule forces asylum seekers into a terrifying game of hide-and-seek with authorities. Jean-Pierre, a Haitian refugee who crossed with his wife and child in 2021, calls the system inhumane. He and his family lived in Indiana before making the dangerous journey north. Now in Western Canada, he's been waiting for a work permit since April, unable to provide for his family while bureaucrats decide his fate. The human cost of these policies is staggering. That woman hiding in the mud with her children isn't an isolated case. After the July crash, 8 people fled into the woods rather than risk being caught by Canadian authorities. They chose hypothermia and starvation over the chance of being denied asylum. This is what Canada's asylum system has become, so hostile that people would rather risk death than interact with it. But the cruelty doesn't end there. Canada's asylum system now operates on what critics call family reunification theater. The only reliable way for Haitians to stay in Canada is to have a first-degree relative already in the country. Everyone else is essentially barred from the asylum process. Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada has extended this family reunification program until November 19, 2025, but advocates say it's a sham. France Andre, coordinator of the Committee for Action of People Without Status, argues that this isn't asylum at all. It's a way for Canada to appear humanitarian while systematically excluding most asylum seekers. The geographic reality makes this even more cruel. Most Haitian asylum seekers cross into Quebec, where the provincial government has doubled down on what critics call ethnic nationalism. The coalition Avenir Quebec has made it clear they don't support making it easier for people to claim asylum from the United States. While the federal government controls asylum policy, Quebec manages its own immigration levels and is currently determining quotas for the next 4 years. The message is clear: Haitians aren't welcome. The broader context makes Canada's actions even more disturbing. Haiti is experiencing what the United Nations calls one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. At least 4,164 people were killed between October and June 2024 alone, with hundreds more kidnapped, raped, and trafficked. Gang violence has made large parts of the country uninhabitable. The State Department maintains a do not travel advisory for Haiti, citing kidnapping, crime, civil unrest, and poor health infrastructure. Yet Canada is arguing that people fleeing this hell don't deserve protection if they came via the United States. The policy is not just cruel, it's strategically stupid. By forcing asylum seekers underground for 14 days, Canada is creating exactly the kind of irregular migration it claims to want to prevent. People are taking greater risks, using more dangerous routes, and relying on smuggling networks because the legal system has become impossible to navigate. Experts predict these dangerous crossings will increase. The combination of ending TPS in the United States and restricting asylum in Canada creates a humanitarian pressure cooker. People aren't going to stop fleeing violence, they're just going to take more dangerous routes to do it. The international implications are equally serious. Canada has long prided itself on being a leader in refugee protection and human rights. Bill C-2 destroys Haiti's reputation. Amnesty International Canada says the bill severely diminishes Canada's international standing when it comes to protecting human rights. The organization warns that the legislation is congruent with the Trump administration's vicious assault on refugee and migrant rights. This isn't hyperbole. Canada is literally adopting Trump's playbook, the same policies that human rights organizations have condemned for years. The 1-year deadline for asylum claims is lifted directly from U.S. immigration law. The expanded detention powers mirror American enforcement tactics. Even the messaging around border security echoes Trump's rhetoric about migrants being a threat to national security. But there's a deeper, more troubling dynamic at work here. Canada isn't just copying American policies, it's trying to make itself less attractive to asylum seekers as a way to avoid conflict with Trump. This is immigration policy as diplomatic appeasement, using vulnerable people as bargaining chips in trade negotiations. The human rights community is watching in horror. Bill C-2 gives Cabinet the power to cancel permanent resident visas, study permits, work permits, and other immigration documents if they believe it's in the public interest. There's no definition of what constitutes public interest, no appeals process, no due process protections. It's executive power without checks or balances. Exactly the kind of arbitrary authority that human rights law is designed to prevent. The bill also dramatically expands information sharing between government departments, essentially creating a surveillance network around immigrants and asylum seekers. Privacy advocates warn this could be used to target vulnerable communities and chill legitimate asylum claims. For Haitians specifically, the timing couldn't be worse. The community is already dealing with systematic discrimination and the constant threat of deportation. Now they face a Canadian system that's actively hostile to their very presence. The psychological impact is devastating. Families that thought they had found safety in Canada are now living in constant fear. Children who enrolled in schools, adults who found jobs, families who began medical treatment, all are facing the possibility of being torn away from the lives they've built. This isn't just about immigration policy, it's about who Canada wants to be as a country. For decades, Canada defined itself in opposition to American immigration enforcement, more humane, more welcoming, more committed to human rights. Bill C-2 destroys that distinction. It turns Canada into America's enforcer, doing the dirty work of keeping asylum seekers away from North America entirely. The economic arguments don't hold up either. Studies consistently show that refugees and asylum seekers contribute more to the economy than they cost. They start businesses, fill labor shortages, and pay taxes. The idea that Canada can't handle current asylum numbers is contradicted by the country's own economic needs and aging population. What we're seeing instead is politics trumping both human rights and economic sense. The conservative opposition, led by Pierre Poilievre, has pushed the liberal government toward increasingly restrictive policies by adopting Trump-style rhetoric about border security and immigration threats.
To drop the retaliatory tariffs a disappointment. They say reciprocal tariffs protect Canadian industries and workers in this trade war, and that dropping them makes us weaker. What's your message to those who are feeling dejected by this move in the steel industry?
Well, I really think that we're keeping the counter tariffs that are linked to steel and to aluminum. And we're concentrating our efforts to fight for the very people that are in the steel sector, that are in the aluminum sector, that are in the auto sector, to make sure that we get to a better deal for them. Because I know I've heard their anxieties. I know that we need to do a lot of work to make sure that we're able to keep these steel plants operating and keeping the jobs. And that's why I was at Algoma Steel in Sault Ste. Marie this summer. That's also why I was at Dofasco, so ArcelorMittal in Hamilton, a couple of weeks ago. And that's why also we came up with $1 billion plan to support the steel workers and the steel businesses.
The U.S. ambassador to Canada, Pete Hoekstra, is frustrated.
The Liberals, terrified of being outflanked on the right, have responded by abandoning their principles and embracing policies they once condemned. The result is a race to the bottom that leaves asylum seekers with nowhere to turn. The United States is ending protection for Haitians. Canada is slamming the door shut. Mexico is overwhelmed and increasingly restrictive. For people fleeing violence and persecution, the options are disappearing. This is creating exactly the kind of humanitarian crisis that international refugee law was designed to prevent. When countries abdicate their responsibilities to protect asylum seekers, people don't stop needing protection. They just become more vulnerable to exploitation, trafficking, and death. The woman hiding in the mud with her children represents everything that's wrong with this system. She wasn't a threat to Canadian security. She wasn't trying to game the system. She was a mother trying to protect her family from violence, forced into hiding by policies that treat asylum seeking as a crime rather than a human right. Her story could be multiplied thousands of times across North America as immigration policies become increasingly punitive and arbitrary. The international community needs to take notice. What Canada is doing isn't just a domestic policy choice. It's a violation of international refugee law and human rights obligations. The principle of non-refoulement, which prohibits returning people to countries where they face persecution, is being systematically undermined by policies that make asylum impossible to obtain. The European Union, the United Nations, and other international bodies need to speak out against these policies and demand that North American countries honor their international obligations. But ultimately, the responsibility lies with Canadian voters and civil society. Bill C-2 is still working its way through Parliament. There's time to stop it, but only if Canadians demand better from their government. Immigration advocates, human rights organizations, and ordinary citizens need to make clear that this isn't the Canada they want to live in. The stakes couldn't be higher. If Bill C-2 becomes law, it will fundamentally change Canada's relationship with human rights and refugee protection. It will turn the country into a fortress, using vulnerable people as shields against American pressure. And it will create a precedent that other countries will follow, making the global refugee crisis even worse. The choice is clear. Canada can continue down this path of increasing restriction and cruelty, or it can remember what it once stood for, a country that welcomed those fleeing persecution and violence, a country that understood that refugee protection isn't just about helping others, it's about maintaining the international system that protects everyone. The woman in the mud is still waiting for an answer. Her children are still wondering if they'll have a future in Canada or if they'll be sent back to a country torn apart by violence. Their fate, and the fate of thousands like them, depends on whether Canada chooses compassion or cruelty. The decision will define not just Canadian immigration policy, but Canada's place in the world. Thanks for watching. If you want to understand more about how immigration policies are reshaping North America, check out our other videos. And if you want to stay updated on the latest developments in refugee protection and human rights, be sure to subscribe for more in-depth analyses and breaking news coverage.